you, Justin. All right. Without further ado, I want to get started. I want to welcome all of you again to joining us on Zoom. Thank you so much. My name is Amber McLaren. I'm here with the Institute for Educational Advancement. And tonight we are lucky enough to have somebody who was with us a year ago. So tonight, Sharon Duncan is coming back to bookend. Last year was talking about going into work from home, school from home, and now we're talking about going back to school, transitioning back to that classroom. What's coming up for gifted kids? Some of you have submitted your questions already online, so thank you for that. If you have questions, feel free to put them in chat, or if you are on Facebook, you can put them on Facebook chat as well. I'll be monitoring those and we can take your questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you so much for joining us. Take it away.
So thank you, Amber. For those of you who I have not met before, my name is Sharon Duncan, and I am an independent consultant. I work with families, I work with schools, and I work with service providers to help them understand and meet the social, emotional, and educational needs of gifted and twice exceptional children. This evening, when I say the word gifted, please know I mean twice exceptional children as well, but I'm simply going to say gifted children. I'm always happy to be at IEA. I have an incredible soft spot for IEA. When my now 23-year-old son was in second, third, and fourth grade, IEA was really a lifesaver for our family. He took the enrichment classes here. It wasn't in these beautiful buildings that you have now. It actually was in an office building down in South Pasadena. And while he was in there on Saturdays all day, having the time of his life, I sat on the couch and outside, because I don't know if you have children like this, but I was always waiting for somebody to call me and tell me I had to pick up my son for some reason. That didn't happen, thank goodness, because IEA fully understood him. But while I was sitting on that couch, I also met a number of families. I met moms that actually still today I'm in touch with. And over the years, we have supported each other and our gifted children in our journeys. And so an organization like IEA, finding your children's tribe, the ripples of that go so far. They go so wide because I had support, my family had support beyond the fact that my son's needs were getting met. So as Amber mentioned, when they called me, we were trying to think of what am I going to speak about? And we discussed that last year I gave a presentation called Never Waste a Good Crisis, where we actually examined what was happening in your living rooms because you had a very private laboratory to study how your children learn. And so this year it only made sense that we talk about transitioning back in the classroom. Now, if we know one thing about gifted kids, we know that very often transitions don't go super well for them. And so I want to really go over a lot of the things that my clients are talking about, a lot of challenges I'm encountering and ways we are working with schools to fix them today. So with that, I'm going to step here aside and we're going to go into slideshow mode. All right. Okay. So I really think that every presentation needs to have a Princess Bride quote in it, actually, to be really good. But this quote is actually really appropriate. So one of the things I find, even when I'm working with teachers in schools and stuff, is that very often the meaning of specific words is what gets us all wrapped around the axle and misunderstanding. And the word gifted is no different from that. So what I find is when people mention the word gifted, very often there's deeply emotional responses to it. Some people think that it is very elitist, and some people think that all children are gifted. And I really like to challenge that notion. To be honest, gifted is just a facet of an individual, a single facet of an individual, no different than if I were to say I'm tall or my daughter is dyslexic. Importantly, giftedness is not the same as achievement. Many high achieving children are not gifted, and many gifted people are high achieving, but some are not. The two terms are not synonymous. And it's really important to know that. It's also really important to know, and this is where some of the elitism feelings come in sometimes, is that giftedness is not a value statement. Gifted individuals are not better than, they're not worse than, but they are different than. And it is really important, as you know, as parents, as you move forward and work with your children and nurture them, that these differences be noticed. It's also really important that we don't ignore the word itself, because otherwise we actually add a layer of shame to something that children cannot necessarily help. They are born gifted, they are gifted. And if we pretend that the word doesn't exist or the concept doesn't exist, we really do the same thing that parents did who loved their children in the 1950s when they actually said, I love you so very much, but please don't tell anybody you're gay. We add a layer of shame to something that they cannot help. For those who have seen me speak before, I am going to do just a few slides on this overview, this Giftedness 101, because it does lay the foundation of what I'm going to talk about later. But hang with me. It's not going to be very long. We're going to get to new content soon. So this is a slide that I put in pretty much every presentation I've ever given. And the reason I do that is because a lot of people say that it is the one that helps them understand giftedness the most. So this is actually a bell curve. And then we're going to talk about IQ scores. And I do want to do a disclaimer that there are many ways to ferret out giftedness. IQ is not the only way to ferret out giftedness. And there's plenty of reasons, especially with twice exceptional children, why a child may not score well on an IQ test, but they are indeed gifted. But while IQ tests are not an incorrect measure, they're not a comprehensive measure. So I want to lay that out there as a disclaimer. But we're going to talk to them about them for a minute and use this particular chart because this chart gives us perspective to have the conversation around what it feels like to be gifted. So this is a bell curve. You can apply a standard bell curve to pretty much anything there is. This is the bell curve of intelligence on people, on human beings. Human beings have 95% interval of human beings have an IQ that lies between 70 on the left and 130 on the right. That's your 95% interval there. So what's really important to notice is where it says 70 on the left is equal distance from the norm to 130 on the right. So 70 on the left is somebody with an intellectual disability. And 130 is where giftedness is typically identified. So I want you to think of the last time you spoke to somebody with an intellectual disability. It is likely you weren't thinking, I can read better, I can do math better, I did better in school. What you're really aware of is that they take in, internally process, and respond to the world in a qualitatively different manner than the norm. Our gifted children also take in, process, and respond to the world in a qualitatively different manner than the norm that is equal to the same as a child with an intellectual disability. Now, we do not tell children with an intellectual ability to act like everybody else. But we do tell that to our gifted children all the time. We tell them to sit in the classroom and act like everybody else. And they may not be able to. They are experiencing the world in a very qualitatively different manner. So I want to do an example of this, and I'm going to use little children on this one. So say a child walks into a classroom, they're a kindergartner, and they sit on the rug, and the teacher asks a question, and the answer is cat. And the gifted kid raises their hand very enthusiastically, and the teacher calls on the kid because gifted kids very often blurt out answers, and they want to reward them for actually raising their hand. And the kid goes, feline. Now, every kid in the room looks at that kid like they've said something very, very strange. The teacher, being very kind, says, yes, everybody, feline is another word for cat. Nobody has done anything wrong. The teacher was kind about it. The little kindergartners, the other little 5-year-olds looked at the kid like they were strange because they said a strange word, which is very age appropriate for a 5-year-old. But that kid goes out on the playground now and tries to have a conversation and tries to interact with those kids. And the fact of the matter is they feel different. They see the world different. They respond to the world in a qualitatively different manner. Another thing I want you to note on this is that even though I talked about 70 on the left and 130 on the right, this bell curve continues. The lines on this continue. So a child with an intellectual developmental disorder, which is 55 on the left, that is as different as from the norm as our highly gifted children over here with an IQ of 145. I want you to take away from this that there is a qualitatively different experience of being in the world. So how many people, I'm sure, have heard me talk about Dabrowski and the overexcitabilities? Kazimierz Dabrowski was a famous Polish psychiatrist and psychologist, and he wrote a theory called the theory of positive disintegration. It's really important to note that this theory was not about intelligence. It was not about IQ. It wasn't even studying that. It was a study of a theory of personality disorder. But as part of that study, he made some observations about people he called of higher intellect. And he did like to study that population, even though this particular study was not about it. And his observations and the vocabulary that he came up with has been adopted by many people in the gifted community because it gives us a vocabulary to describe the things we commonly see. What's really important is the overexcitabilities are not an IQ test. They're not an intelligence test. They are observations that we commonly see. So I'd like you to take away from here the fact that you can have a common vocabulary to help describe this, and also maybe to feel comforted that if you haven't heard about these before, your children are not the only ones necessarily experiencing them. So what Dabrowski noticed was in 5 distinct areas is that individuals with higher intellect seem to react stronger for a longer period of time and even earlier to stimuli that may be smaller, even imperceivable to other people. And he called them superstimulant abilities, and he felt that they impacted the central nervous system, not just emotional responses. Nobody uses the word superstimulant abilities anymore, mostly because they can't spell it, and it's also not going to give you a spell check. But if you want to look up more online, you can look up overexcitabilities or intensities. But in fact, now that we have things like MRIs and things such as that, what we're finding is we can actually see some of this in science. So he was right in assuming that there could be more here than as the central nervous system, not necessarily simply emotional responses. The 5 areas he noted were psychomotor overexcitability. And these are the kids with the surplus energy. They fidget, they wiggle, they talk incessantly and fast, very compulsive, enthusiastic about everything, intensely driven, can be very competitive. And these kids can be very exhausting to be around. They may appear hyperactive, they may appear impulsive. I do want to give one more disclaimer. If your child is not experiencing any of these, it doesn't mean they're not gifted any more than this is an IQ test. The next overexcitability was the imaginational overexcitability. And this is often characterized by very divergent, creative, or imaginative thinking. These kids may confuse reality with fantasy. The visual thinkers, they love metaphors and puns. These are the little boys at 16 who are still playing dress up. Some people think of that as immature. I think of it as Steven Spielberg. So the world doesn't necessarily always understand that this is an incredible gift. These are the college people you see at Denny's at 2:30 in the morning. I guarantee you they're there playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's why Denny's is open at 2:30 in the morning. As they grow up, they may appear immature. They may appear like they have ADD as they disappear inside their head. They may appear to be deviant because they like things that are novel and new. The next overexcitability is the one that most people think of when they think of giftedness, and that is the intellectual overexcitability. And it's really important to think of here is anybody can learn, but there's a difference between I can learn and I have a rage to learn, and that if I don't learn, I'm unhappy. So we often see with gifted children is that they have an extreme rage to learn. These can be our independent and very keen analytical thinkers. They ask probing and endless questions. And if you have one of these kids and they're little, then you're used to that. And at 12 at night, the questions are coming. One of the hallmarks we often see with this population is they think about thinking. There's a lot of self-analysis here that, a therapist would think was really good in a 40 or 50-year-old, but we can see it in very little kids. If I'm thinking this, I wonder why I'm thinking this. And if I change my mind, somebody said this, what would I be thinking then? So there's a lot of circular reasoning around their own thinking. We also can see tremendous concentration in their area of interest, not necessarily in the things they're supposed to pay attention to at school. And one of the other hallmarks we see, and this is kind of the bane of existence for a lot of very young kids on the playground, is a focus on moral concerns and issues of fairness and truth. So this whole following the rules things on the playground can really cause a lot of challenges to our first and second graders, where other kids just care about playing, they care about the rules. So the intellectual overexcitability, besides that rage to learn, these kids may be seen as impatient, bossy, rude, or strong-willed. The sensual overexcitability is heightened sensory sensitivity. These are the kids with a very strong aesthetic awareness. They may love the limelight. These are the kids that may have challenges with food, not just taste, but in texture, in smell, even in the color of the food. These are the kids that you have to cut out the tags in their clothes. And sometimes this can even look like children on the spectrum. There's a lot of overlap there. These kids may seem oversensitive or immature. So if that junior high kid goes to the movie and the movie is sad, the other little kids may be making fun of it, and this kid may be in a puddle on the floor crying. The last one, and this is the one that Dabrowski actually noted was the most common and the most intense, and those of us who work with this population also believe this to be true, and that is the emotional overexcitability. Everything is big. These are extreme, complex, and very intense emotions, all emotions. These are the kids that worry excessively. They have fears, anxieties, expressions of guilt, even when things are not their fault. So they see a homeless person as they're driving to school, and now they feel very guilty that they can't affect world hunger. They may display anger, rage, or cynicism. These kids are often very self-critical, and they often have feelings of inadequacy. A lot of this stems from the fact that they often hold themselves to a very high bar. A lot of people think that gifted individuals are going to be arrogant, but in fact, often they tend to be very self-critical and very ashamed of the fact that they cannot reach the internal goals that they have set for themselves because the teacher wanted them to do a diorama in a shoebox and they were trying to build the Taj Mahal. So their expectations for themselves often let them down. They let their own selves down. They can have difficulty adjusting to new environments. Welcome to the COVID world. And they can feel extreme loneliness and the inability to connect with age mates. This is something we see an awful lot. We are attracted to and have friendships with people we have a lot in common with. And sometimes what happens is this population, even in the very lower grades when they're very young, are looking for in friendships what other people may be looking for in a marriage. And not all second and third graders are wanting that. They'd rather just go out and play in the sandbox. So we often see a distinct loneliness here or feeling like they're an alien. This is where organizations like IEA actually provide the opportunity for them to be with like-minded peers, which is very important. On the emotional overexcitability, really you can get anything big, but they may seem anxious, depressed, they may have very low self-esteem. Now, I want to say that every single one of these These are some price tags associated with it. The parents often feel relieved to know that they're not alone. But every one of these is actually a bonus too. That psychomotor overexcitability, those people get things done. You want them on your team, especially in the adult world. But those are the people who get the projects done. Again, the imaginational overexcitability. We live in LA. There's a lot of them there that are like that. Even actually the Silicon Valley, any type of career that requires extreme imagination. Intellectual overexcitabilities, there's our scholars, our deep thinkers, our sensual overexcitability. You think, well, how can that help me? Hey, those are our best chefs. Those are the people that know how to take advantage. Could be our musicians who fully understand how everything connects in the world. And the emotional overexcitability, one thing I say with parents is most of us want more than anything in the world for our children to live life to its fullest. And if you have this range of emotions, you're going to live life to its fullest. It's not always going to be roses, but it's going to be to its fullest. And how beautiful is that? So there are so many definitions for giftedness. And in fact, a lot of school districts have their own definitions, mostly because schools often see giftedness as achievement oriented, and also schools tend to define giftedness based on the services they can provide. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. They're not lying. This is how we're going to define it because we can help it in this manner. But my favorite definition of giftedness is by the Columbus Group. And the Columbus Group definition says that giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awarenesses that are qualitatively different from the norm. And this asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modification in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. All of these words are golden, but there are two pieces of this that I find especially helpful. The first one is that asynchronous development. And when you're talking to anybody about giftedness, this is the term you can use if you want to dance around the phrase to teachers, etc. If you talk to them and say, my child is very asynchronous in their development, they're very good at this and they have challenges with this, everybody tends to think that this is a little easier to deal with. This is a term that they can see. What this looks like in real life is a fourth grader who can read and analyze at 10th grade level, and they're doing math at 7th grade level. They have the handwriting of their age group, and then they have a meltdown because they have a sock wrinkle. And they can argue like a trial lawyer. They know more than the docent at the museum about dinosaurs. So they're kind of all over the map. If you were to take all of child development, put it in a blender and hit pulse, that's kind of what it looks like. And as hard as it is to parent that or teach it, it's really hard to be it. So that child is coming from a perspective of not being on earth very long and having all of these different developmental capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses all put together. The other piece of this that is very important is that it increases with a higher intellectual capability. So what we often see, though not universally, is the higher to the right of that bell curve we get, the more we see asynchrony. So some of the common expressions of the overexcitability, both at home and the classroom, I kind of separated these out because I wanted people to see as we're talking about school and home transition. At home, we can see that they act out if they're not intellectually challenged. We can see that incessant talking and the asking of questions. See that at school too. It's not like these are only seen in one place. The drive for truth and justice and precision. I remember my daughter having an all-out argument with a grandparent over the difference between a cardigan and a sweater. And I think she was maybe 4 or 5. They are able to do things they've never been taught before. This is quite common if we think about the gifted brain and all the connections that it has within it. That brain is busy behind the scenes putting connections together. So somebody says one piece of information and they're able to connect everything and do things that they haven't been taught before. is hypersensitive to light, sounds, food, overwhelmed by empathy, lonely, does not connect with age mates necessarily, difficult sleeping, gave up naps early sometimes, self-critical, strong need for autonomy. This came out in the pandemic. And enjoys subtle humor beyond their years. Sometimes procrastinates on purpose. This is interesting because a lot of people say, my child procrastinates. They could do this in 3 seconds flat, this huge report, but they wait until the very, very last minute. Now, sometimes it's executive functioning and they just didn't plan right, but sometimes they do it on purpose, even if they're not aware of it, because when they wait till the last minute, it's much more exciting trying to get it done for a deadline. So sometimes procrastination is a way to make something boring very joyful by adding the element of time to it. In the classroom, we have the trouble with multiple choice tests. That's really interesting. And that is, a lot of these kids can come up with a rationale for every single answer. And so they will maybe not even finish the test because they're trying to figure out which of those is the right one because all of them are right. And the teacher says it's A, and then they get all mad because they can make a good case for B, C, and D. So what we tell them when they go into this is to answer it like everybody else does. That's really easy. They know what the teacher wants. They know what they're supposed to do, but they were trying to find the right answer. And so they were just kind of wrapping themselves around the apps and looking for that. Sometimes they resist assignments involving handwriting. If you think about this, for those children who are very advanced intellectually in their reading comprehension and their analysis skills, sometimes their hand has not caught up with their ability to express themselves. And that continues, not just when they're little, but when they're little and they're just learning their ABCs and how to write by hand, it's very evident. But think about the 7th grader who was trying to write that master's thesis in their head. Even then, their hand may be too slow for being able to get out what's going on in their head. We see perfectionism, challenges. They challenge the teacher quite frequently. They don't necessarily mean to challenge the teacher, but they're out for truth and they're digging for what's right. And it may feel challenging to the teacher. Sometimes they dislike group projects because they feel like the group is not necessarily living up to how it should be. And so sometimes these kids will take on too much. We ask teachers in that situation to give roles to different people so that they don't take over the work. They may refuse or fight to do homework, or it may take forever. There's many different reasons for that. They may refuse to show the math work because they may not even know how they got the answer. They may actually be intuiting it, or it may seem very painful to walk through the steps. When that happens, we kind of make we negotiate with the teacher. Can they just write down the work for just a couple of them? They may overcomplicate things. This goes in line with procrastinates because they're making it more interesting. Sometimes they rush so much, they turn in sloppy work. They often refuse repetition or memorization because that's way more painful for them than the novel. They can blurt out answer or ask unrelated questions. That's actually very related to the one where I mentioned at home, which is that they know things they've never been taught. Also, in the blurting out the answers, sometimes it's just so exciting that it just comes out of their body, and they do have to learn not to do that. We will put like a blurt book at their desk. So instead of yelling the answer, we say, write it down on the book. And they can be very frustrated with pacing. So these are common. These are not necessarily pandemic related, but these are common. And I can teach like 3 hours on this. So let's set the stage. That was my Gifted 101. The pandemic has now really impacted 2 school years. So to put that into perspective, if your child is entering 2nd grade this year, they have never experienced a real school year. 3rd graders were last in a classroom for kindergarten. There's a big difference between a kindergarten classroom and a 3rd grade classroom. 4th graders have had as many unique school years as calm and interrupted ones. 5th graders and above will be experiencing school in a very different manner than they ever remember. I want you to look at that. That's 4th and 5th grade. We think of this pandemic as last year. This is a much more long-term impact. A lot of kids were impacted by that if you think of normal school development. Schools, teachers, parents, admin, everybody's tired. And maybe even afraid or worried. So I want to talk just a minute first about how the OEs may impact some transition back to school. These are things that I've seen. They may or may not affect your child, and you may have other things, and you can chime in on that, and we can talk about them. I have the questions that were sent early. Your child may be experiencing excessive fidgeting, talking out of turn, inability to sit still, blurting out those answers, chewing on things. The important thing to remember here is the psychomotor overexcitability is the physical expression of emotional tension. So things are coming out of their body. And it doesn't necessarily mean bad things. It doesn't mean that they're unhappy. It doesn't mean they're anxious. It doesn't mean they're sad. It can be that they're very, very happy and they're just jumping around. The psychomotor overexcitability is all of these different emotions, but things are different. And again, not all of these kids are really, really good about taking on different. Some love it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But we may see a lot of the psychomotor excitability. What's really important to remember is telling them to stop it and sit still is only going to make it worse. So what's really good is to talk to them about why it's hard to sit still. Talk to them about the impact of when you get up and do these different things on the classroom and stuff. Give them off-ramps. Let them doodle, let them draw, give them something to manually play with. Let them move out of the classroom if they have to, have the teacher and then come up with a secret hand signal so we know that when they need that off ramp. And then talk to the teacher about building that muscle, because there's a lot of muscle to rebuild if they haven't been in school for a year and a half, especially if they're little. Another one we see is daydreaming, inventing alternatives, improvements to the new rules, enjoying the novelty of the new situation. So this is our imaginational overexcitability. So for the kids who have this return to school is like a novel with a new plot twist. And for some kids with the imaginal overexcitability, that is so exciting, they can't even see straight. Yay, it's new. It's something very interesting, something I've never seen before. How cool is this? They may start going into improvements to the rule. They may start bringing in all of that intellectual overexcitability and start trying to write new rules. Alternatively, they may not like it. They may feel very uncomfortable, and they may escape into their heads and start daydreaming, because that's what imaginational overexcitability kids sometimes do. We may see the meltdowns, the anxiety and irritation, lack of concentration due to the adjustment of the new sensory stimuli, or stimuli they forgot how to tolerate. So sensory is huge this year. Not only the regular sensory, wearing a mask all day at school, having to sit separate. Some kids are sensory or seeking. They seek touch. Some try to move away from it. So now the kindergartners can't hug each other, and that used to calm some of them down. There's so many pieces about it, and especially because they haven't had it practiced for a while. It's likely your home environment was pretty cool for them by and large, and now they're being bombarded way back again. So plain and simple, overloads on all fronts. Everything is going to come out emotionally, and it's going to come out in all of these different ways using the overexcitabilities. So I think that everybody was a superhero last year. Parents were, teachers were, admin was, your kids were. Everybody deserves a superhero cape. And while I know you don't want to reflect on the past, that presentation I gave last year was really important, because very rarely do you have a chance to actually examine how your children are learning and responding to school. While it may not have been exactly school, you've actually had a chance to take a look at it. So reflect on this. Are there things that your children, when they were at home, missed as part of school? Examples would be friends. Examples would be the playground. And vice versa, are there things that actually they were really happy they weren't there? I know a lot of kids, this was their best time ever. They actually loved the pandemic because there wasn't the social pressure. There wasn't the smell of the lunchroom. There were many reasons for a lot of these kids not to dislike the fact that they weren't in school, but some of them missed it tremendously in the structure and everything else. So take a good time, take some time to really reflect on that. Did they miss the structure routine of school? Did they miss their friends? Did they miss yada, yada, yada? Were they able to develop a relationship with their teacher? This is pretty important. One of the things we find from year to year is the single most important factor in a child having a good school year is the relationship they were able to develop with their teacher. Last year, these teachers were so stressed and so overwhelmed, and everybody was online. Your child may not have been able to develop a relationship with the teacher, and that may impact how they enter the school year even this year. And they may be craving that relationship, and teachers are still overwhelmed, and they're facing children in their classroom that have a wide range of transition situations going on. So pay attention to that. Did they move ahead, fall behind, or stay on track? And I'm sorry I said it this way. I actually don't think anybody fell behind last year, and I really wish I had worded this different. Did they move ahead? And we're going to talk about this in a minute. Did they stay on track? Or do you think that they're going to struggle in the classroom? Reflect on how much they know about COVID, how they feel about COVID, how they feel about going back, how you feel about COVID, and how you feel about going back, because all of this is impacting their return to the classroom. Okay, so now they're back in the class. We're going to start looking forward. I kind of put off the academic progress. I said I wanted to table that just for a little bit on the last slide. So here's why. If your child is behind a little bit in any area, the teachers are well equipped to work with that. A lot of children kind of slid just a little bit. But again, I want to put that in a larger perspective. They lived through a pandemic. They didn't fall behind academically. Let's not go down that track. However, some kids have such an incredible rage to learn. And I was talking to a therapist I worked with recently, and she was saying that she has seen children who, with this rage to learn, took advantage of the time they had during the pandemic, and there were no reins on them. People were just happy that they were busy and learning. Kids have moved ahead as much as 5 grade levels. So if you have a very highly gifted kid who took advantage of this time to study themselves into oblivion because they find that fun, and believe me, not all kids do, and there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean they're not gifted. Some of them are just wired that way. And your child may have simply moved ahead in their area of interest, a single area of interest. The point here is we know our children are asynchronous. They may be entering this school year even more asynchronous than they ever have. They may have not paid attention as much as they could, and they could get away with more on the areas they didn't like. And the areas they did like, they may have self-taught themselves even farther ahead. So if you had a kid who was ranging in maybe 4 grade levels, they may be 6 and 7 grade levels right now, just simply because of how they approach learning. The rules will be different and the environment will be different. And this is really important. There's, as we mentioned before, a lot of these kids are rule followers. Some of them are rule breakers. And now there's new rules to break. How cool is that? And some of them just simply love the novel. And that's going to keep them super busy and happy for a little bit. So your kid may be any one of these things. And it's super important to talk to them about why there's rules, why these particular rules in your school exist. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later, practice them, but have these discussions, validate their feelings around the new rules and the new situation at school. You can even role play. So they have more, in a world where things are so shifting and changing, helping those expectations can be very helpful. So role play with them. Talk to your kids about the new social norms. I mentioned a little bit ago about the kindergartners not being able to hug each other. There's a lot of new social norms. I just visited a school a couple days ago, and they beautifully made their cafeteria so there's beautiful plexiglass and stuff like that, so the kids can see each other. Their voices are loud, so they're yelling over the plexiglass and everything. But the fact of the matter is, they're little plexiglass cubes. That's different. There's a lot of social norms. So it feels very different. And remember, these kids can be very sensitive to how things are feeling. How am I doing on time here?
We're just shy of 7.
Okay, perfect. So talk to them about all of this. Okay, so here's a big one, especially in the grades like 4th and 7th and 8th and stuff like that. Friendships groups will have shifted. A year and a half is a very long time in a child's life in not seeing someone every day. These kids are all experiencing different things at home with their families. There's a lot of tension everywhere, and friendship groups may have shifted significantly. So kids will go back and maybe they were super popular and now they're not, etc. Maybe they weren't popular and now they are, or everybody's scrambling and jockeying for position. But the groups will have shifted in some way. What's important here is to talk to your child about that. Another thing you can do is to help them learn that friendships do shift. When you see somebody every single day, year upon year upon year, it doesn't feel like things shift as much. But we know as adults that you grow up, you get out of high school, you go to college, you go these different directions, you have kids, you get married, friendships shift. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the friendship or you or the other person. So have conversations with them about this, because in many ways, a major life transition just happened to them. You may want to, if your child is having a hard time with the safety measures, you may want to practice them at home just to get them used to that and the safety of their own home. That may feel very painful to you, that you don't want to walk around the house today with the mask on, but do different things that you can to make them feel comfortable. Okay, this is really, really important. Children will share their pandemic experiences. If you were fortunate enough to make it through the pandemic without losing a family member or without having a family member get ill, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in your child's school or classroom will have had that same fortune. So people have died and families have had a lot of tragedy around the maybe jobs got lost. There's so much that has gone on. It's important that if your child has experienced this, that you help them with the conversation such that they know they don't have to answer questions that they don't want, or help them understand how to answer questions if they do want to. So have these conversations and practice the discussions. Alternatively, their best friend, maybe they lost their aunt or something like that. Teach them how to have those conversations where they're not invasive. And teach them talk to them about, this isn't humanity's first rodeo, and we've had pandemics before, and life does go on, and help them understand that while we continue to have to be flexible, the world does move forward, and we do make it out of this, no matter what that might look like in the end. Give them some hope on the other side of this. But prepare them for those very difficult conversations. It's scary to think that we are sending a second grader to school to have to talk about death, but it's going to come up. It's going to come up if it's happened within your class in your school. So prepare them for it. This is a biggie for Cotton student schools. One of the things I deal with a lot when I'm working with schools and parents and advocacy, very often gifted kids, their intellectual ability and their understanding of content is far above their student skills. So they know everything, but they can't sit there and write a 5-paragraph essay, and they can't take notes, they can't raise their hand, they can't even maybe sometimes even sit in their seat for the 45 minutes of the lesson, but they need the content. So every child, not just gifted children, every child is probably a little bit rusty on their student skills. And this is probably one of the things that poor teachers are having to deal with a lot. So if your child is having a really hard time, certainly have the conversation with them. Talk to them about the fact that student skills and content are two different things, so they know that. Talk to them about the fact that student skills are learned and their muscles have atrophied, perhaps, because they haven't gotten that routine. If your child is having an especially hard time, talk to the teacher and don't say we're going to throw all those rules out the window, but make a plan for moving forward in a way that your child can rebuild those skills. The other side of the coin is sometimes because their skills are less and their intellect is higher, what I am finding now that school has gotten back into the realm, their classmates have actually fallen behind to where the gifted kid is. And so sometimes it's kind of evened out the playing field. So it just really does depend on the situation. One of the things in a world where everything feels out of control is to give your child at least a little bit of control and predictability. And this is more for your young ones. I know the first week or two when kids went back to school, this I don't know where my spare mask is seemed to be the issue that you would think the world was falling apart. I mean, the schools can help them and all of that, but if you're dealing with a very emotional child, that's a big deal. So organizing their backpack, letting them help you make lunch, bedtime, all of these things, which are standard parenting stuff. In a world where things are changing every day, meaning your class gets tested once a week and you don't know until Monday whether school's going to be in session for your classroom, et cetera, giving them a portion of their day or pieces of their day. In the morning, that backpack. At lunch, you know what they're going to eat. Giving them a little bit of predictability can help a lot. So this is a lot about predictability and giving them control over their life when everything else seems to be a little out of control. Talk to them about their expectations and possible alternatives. Kids don't always think of the alternatives. I'm going to go to school and it's going to look like this, and I'm going to sit next to so-and-so, and I'm going to have this for lunch, yada, yada, yada. And they have this huge plan for the day. And one thing doesn't go right, and now they've just melted down. So have a discussion whenever possible about alternatives. Well, if that didn't happen, what do you think you could do? That helps actually bend their flexibility muscle. Reflect on your own thoughts and feelings and worries and expectations about school. We're all carrying stuff forward from this last year, not just teachers and kids. And model calm and confident behavior. It's best to your ability. So this is actually my last slide, and this is my pep talk slide. This situation, this pandemic has been hard on everyone, on your family, on our country, on the entire world. And as a human race, we've all endured so much in this last year and a half. But no matter how out of control things feel like they've been, we all get the chance to write our own narrative about this once-in-a-generation event. Every single person, every single family gets to write their own narrative. This is really important. We're not defined by the fact that we live life. We're actually defined by how we live life. So change the narrative. Change the narrative not to the fact that this happened to you, but how you managed through a pandemic, which doesn't mean that you didn't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that things weren't sloppy, but talk about how you managed through the pandemic as a family. This will cement your family. It will bring out the fact that everything was hard and you get to write your own narrative. And I guarantee you that when your children are talking to their grandchildren, they're going to pull forward the narrative you write in this once-in-a-generation event. Change the perspective. Thank each other. Have the conversation with each other. Thank you for bringing me a cup of coffee when I was having a complete meltdown. Thank your kids. Have your kids thank each other if you can possibly get them to do that. You might have kids do a piece of art or something about your lockdown. One thing that the pandemic has taught us, and there's silver linings in everything, is that flexibility is a lesson the world has had to learn over and over and over. And I think I mentioned this in my last presentation, was one of the biggest things I was hoping would come out of the pandemic, and I actually am seeing this, is number one, teachers and parents seeming to have a lot more appreciation and patience with each other through these very difficult times. And I'm also seeing that teachers who used to, because everything was structured, they knew how the world was going to be, they knew a route to success. What they didn't know is that there were many routes to success. And so as an advocate, this last year, I saw so many teachers. I would enter the classroom, and as a general rule, I will tell you that almost all teachers they're just really good. Mostly they're very flexible, but occasionally they get one that only knows one way to do things. Everybody was so overwhelmed this last year that when you approached a teacher, the standard response was, whatever, if it works, let's just keep going. And that was the right response. Everybody was doing their best. And what I'm hoping is a lot of them found out that there are many different ways to do things that they hadn't thought of before, especially when it comes to trying to satisfy the needs of gifted and twice exceptional children. But write your own narrative. All right, Amber, you want to talk? Let's do questions.
I do. I want to just stop for a moment and say thank you so much. This was really informative and very emotional, quite frankly. There were a lot of moments where I had to really wrap my head around what these children are experiencing. So thank you very much for walking us through that. We did get questions online. I'll read them to you and we can discuss them. The first one, during distance learning, their child had much less homework. A gifted kid's dream because they can pursue their own passions, just like we mentioned. And now that they're back in school, they're struggling with building physical and emotional stamina for full days, full sports, and back to full loads of homework. They tend to be 100% in and engaged in the classroom and are coming home with complete sensory overload. One of the extroverted, introverted, and the other, they have multiple kids. One is an extroverted and the other is an introvert. But mostly they are struggling with going back to the before. While they missed face-to-face interaction, they did not miss more hours of school. And I sense, or maybe it's just a gifted mom, that they feel wrong about just going back and are, let me get this straight here, feel wrong about going back to before because they are still so turned into what's going on in the world, whether that's COVID, Afghanistan, etc. So the question is, what is the least amount of extracurriculars possible? Please help.
So the least amount of extracurriculars, I think that every family gets to choose. I don't think there's one right answer to that. Every family, every child, well, basically, I'll say the parents get to choose that because, some of these kids make their parents feel so guilty if they're not involved in 300 activities. And the parents still will go to bed thinking they haven't done enough. I think as a parent, you can look at your child and you can choose. And there's no right and there's no wrong answer. This is the same thing with the use of technology. And I get that question a lot. How much is the appropriate use of technology? It depends. It depends on you. It depends on your child. If you see your child out of gas because they're learning these muscles, it may be that you step back from some of that. The other thing I would say, though, is sometimes the extracurriculars are the things that give them the gas to be able to get through the day. Something I see quite frequently with gifted children, and I'm going to pick on math for a second. A kid who's in the third grade, but they're doing fifth grade math on their own, and the school will not accommodate that. Sometimes if we give them math enrichment outside of class, they're perfectly willing to go in and be happy during the day for that one period. So in that case, the outside enrichment or the outside activity was the oxygen that allowed them to get through the day. So you have to kind of look at all of that. That said, if they're building the muscle and they're willing to give something up, then maybe that's what you do. Another thing I would do also is talk to the teacher and let them know that they're struggling. If they're making it through the day and they're coming home and it's just too much and they can demonstrate mastery, maybe we get them out of some of the homework. Look, if they're demonstrating mastery with half the homework, let's do that. until January and then try to start pushing more. If it's, maybe it's not even necessary ever. Sometimes teachers will see that if it's not necessary, it's not necessary. So many different answers depending on the situation of the child.
This is a perfect segue to the next question, which is how do you recommend to advocate to the student's teacher to help them adjust? What can they be talking about with these teachers?
Well, I think that the teachers, in this particular case, believe it or not, I actually think the teachers are going to understand a little bit more because they're seeing this across the board, not just with the gifted kids. So everybody's coming back and everybody's slightly a hot mess over one thing or another. And they're struggling. So I think one of the biggest things is to let the teacher know that your child specifically is having trouble with these things. Making them aware is the first step. So they see it across the board, but they don't know what's going on in your particular household. I guarantee you, if you go up and you talk to the teacher, you will not be the only parent they have in their class who is approaching them and talking to them. In fact, what I'm seeing is a lot of schools are actually approaching this holistically because they understand that this is the case. And so it is a discussion with the teacher, and it is, in my opinion, I like to ask teachers what their goal is for different assignments, and then see if there's different ways that you can accomplish that goal that are acceptable to the teacher. So if the goal of the assignment is to understand the material and they already understand the material, then the assignment is not necessary. If the goal of the assignment is to make sure that they can write 3 sentences in a row and your child can master that after, practicing it twice, then we don't need to do 10 times. So you kind of take a look at it. When you approach things in that manner, you actually get the teachers more on board because you're not telling them that their assignments and their rubric is not necessary. You're saying, what are you expecting? What are you expecting them to learn? And then you're tailoring it to your child.
I really like this. What is your goal? And then as a parent and a student, you can reverse engineer
exactly
how to achieve that goal.
That's exactly. And I find that when we advocate in that manner, teachers are much, much more willing to go along. It's not an adversarial relationship. And in fact, sometimes when we go in there and we talk to teachers like that, and we explain the world through the child's eyes, teachers can be super clever about coming up with actual solutions to things. And the goal is not to tell them what to do. The goal is to say, here's the problem. Here's what's happening. This is why it's happening to my child. What can we do to solve it? We usually get teachers on board.
Excellent advice. The next question here is from a parent who's asking about how to talk about Dabrowski's overexcitabilities with their teacher, but not coming off as a demanding parent or a parent who thinks their child is incredibly special and brilliant. So how do they maybe broach those?
That's why I wrote the little handout that I gave everybody. So I got this question in advance, and I asked Amber to do printouts, which the people here have printouts, but we can actually make available online. Amber can tell you where to find that.
And I will.
Okay. And basically, this is a little handout that I made. I made this it was in 2017. So that was how many years ago? I'm not a math person. And so I made this little handout, and I know it's used by even a lot of psychologists and pediatricians to hand to parents when they're first trying to figure out their children's giftedness. And it's kind of like a little 6-page Giftedness 101 that explains the lens of giftedness. And it talks about Dabrowski and stuff like this. It actually is translated in 5 different languages. So I would suggest they hand that to their teacher and have a conversation around it.
And for those of you joining us online, if you're on Zoom, I have your emails. I will share that attachment in an email. For those of you on Facebook, please feel free to reach out to me, Amber McLaren at Institute for Educational Advancement, and I can get you a copy as well. We have a couple more questions, so I'm going to get back to these. Changing gears just a little bit. A parent asked, how do we help preteens and tweens to integrate socially in a new school? That's right. Some of these kids left one school.
Exactly.
And they're starting in a brand new school.
So a couple of different things. First of all, when you change schools because you've had a grade change, maybe you're going to middle school or high school, you can have a little bit of relief. And a lot of times everybody's new there. Not always. Some schools are K-12 and your kid may have just changed. But if it's due to a grade change, everybody's a little off kilter a little bit. It is interesting finding what I like to do, especially in the tweens and the teens, is have them join clubs that are of interest to them. So while they may not always find like-minded peers as far as intellectual, though they may, they can often find peers through shared interests. So maybe it's robotics, maybe it's film, maybe it's media, maybe it's cartoons, whatever it happens to be, is if the school has clubs, have them see if they can join clubs. And so that's one way. Another thing I will say, and you can't necessarily do this with a high schooler, but I got to tell you, I know a fair number of families who are still doing it with their tweens and even their middle schoolers, is weirdly enough still making playdates for their kids when they're 12 and 13 years old. And that doesn't look like, you don't use the word playdate because that doesn't go down. But you can say, hey, I met so-and-so's mother, we're going to a movie. Let's go, and pull them around. So I know that sounds very engineered, but if you have a child that may, depending on whether they are an introvert or an extrovert, is very introverted, you may need to do that. I also have had a fair number of kids this year, of all things, they're starting clubs. And I think clubs kind of fell by the wayside a little bit because the pandemic is the teachers didn't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that on top of everything else. Clubs very often land in the laps of teachers as well as their normal job. Is what I am finding is my clients who are approaching teachers to want to start clubs, the teachers are actually really excited to do so. So I think clubs, sports, things like that are really some of your best ways in outside activities that your kid is interested in.
Excellent. We've got another question here about teens. Is there some providing organizational and self-care support for teens who don't think they need it and often won't ask for help?
It is really hard when you're dealing with teens, isn't it? Because, they are little adults and they're really good at putting on the brakes. What I have told parents before, I am not a mental health professional, so I do need to preface my answer on that. What I have told parents before is to start with the parents going to a professional, and that professional will likely have some very good advice on helping the parents guide the child there. So mental health professionals are used to this. They're even used to this with adults who don't want help. So they're really good at helping parents find the words for that. And that is what I would suggest.
And going back a little bit here to the elementary school level, we've got a parent who is struggling with attendance. We've got a gifted sixth grader who has an attendance problem. Sometimes they have headaches or stomach aches and they don't have to go to school on those days. But the school is already holding perfect attendance contests. How do they juggle that with this?
So there's a lot of things going on. Actually, it's seen that question. There's a lot of things going on that. When a child is not going to school, I always like to, some kids, I will say some kids have figured out that there's great ways to get out of school and do other things. But more often than not, there is something going on, and it could be as physical as migraines. It could be there's a lot of these kids with their autoimmune challenges and allergies and things such as that. There's usually a reason underneath it. If we are having a lot of attendance problems that are due to distinct physical challenges, there's not a lot you can do other than talk to the school and talk to the child. Their physical challenge isn't going to go away. The school encouraging attendance isn't going to go away. So it's a matter of helping that child learn how to emotionally be okay with that. The other side is if the physical challenge is there, but you think that there could be more underneath it, I always encourage parents to really, really start digging about what else is possibly there. Now, if the child is only resisting school when these are happening, and otherwise they waltz into the classroom as happy as they can be, then we are dealing with physical challenge and nothing more. But if in fact they are resisting school all the way around, and then also suffer from some of these other things, they may be related and there may be something else going on there. And at that point, it may be time to talk to the physician or a mental health professional to see if there's something deeper going on that people don't know about.
I think that's all excellent advice. And you're right, there are two different things going on. One is the school culture and focusing on full attendance. And the other is the individual child and what's going on in their world that might be causing them to stay home.
And so when we talk about school culture, to be honest, I don't love that. I don't love the taking of attendance and rewards and stuff like that. But there are some fights that aren't worth fighting, or they take so much energy, you don't have the energy to do other things. And I think making the school aware that you have a child who perhaps, it sounds like in this, the child cares about attendance, but is having trouble with it. It's important to let the school know that. If there are 600 other parents with the same complaint, they may stop it. If you're the only one, it's not going to stop it. And so that just kind of, and if the school is otherwise wonderful and you're one of 5 out of 100 that do not like this, your chances of getting that tossed are very small. So put your energies elsewhere and talk to your child, because there's going to be things in their life that they don't love. And so these are these deeper conversations, and it hurts. It hurts, but it's also a learning opportunity.
I think that last point you made is really key, that this is a learning opportunity, and these kids are experiencing work-life balance just like the rest of adults are facing work-life balances, and those are tough conversations to have, but important conversations to have. We've got one last question here, and this touches on the same thing we talked about earlier. We've got a student here who is reintegrating into the social experience at school and feeling different, still feeling isolated, struggling with developing friendships. What if the gifted kids' experience didn't change for this pandemic? How do they deal with that social emotional piece?
Well, I think that they're always going to feel different. And that's the part where there's so many facets to this too. First of all, finding like-minded peers somewhere is super important. So whether it be IEA, if your child's in Davidson, if they're in CTY, if they're in whatever, finding a like-minded peer group is vital for these kids. And it doesn't have to be at school. I'd love it to be at school for every child, but it's often not at school. So I think it's really important that children who feel that different and that lonely know it's okay, and that there are others out there like them. That alone. There's kids that go to a summer camps for the gifted, UNASA, right? So UNASA, you guys have 2 of them. 1 week a year makes them know they're okay. So they're able to tolerate the rest of the school year having surface level friends, because they know that they're not alone. That just can help solve that void. As far as going to school, again, it's a matter of trying to find interest-related peers sometimes. So trying to find the clubs, trying to find the activities, talking to the teacher. Do you know another child who is similar to my child? A lot of times teachers will facilitate actual introductions and friendships, because it may be a child in a different grade level that you don't even know about. And so getting the teachers help involved and having them know they're not alone intellectually is important. And then if you do not have those kids around there, it is a matter of helping them feel comfortable going to different groups and clubs and things like that. Now, I want to put that all aside. For some kids, 3,000 friends makes them feel unpopular. Nobody likes them because nobody likes them. They're not popular, or they only have 3,000 friends. For other kids, seeing a child 1 hour a week is all they need to feel like they have good friendship. So some kids feel perfectly satisfied with very limited friendships. So one of the things I often talk to parents is, how does the child feel about their friendships? Because sometimes as parents, we put our own lens on it. But if the child themselves, and it sounds like in this particular case, the child is feeling like they're out of it, the child is looking for more friends. Knowing that friendships take time, and it is important to know that friendships don't happen overnight, they're not instant, and they do take time to develop, and they have to stick with it, and friendships are fluid, and they move in and out is what you can do. And talking to your kids about your own friendships and how you felt growing up as a child can all be helpful.
This feels very similar to the atrophy of the student muscle, that the friendship muscle could have also atrophied if they've been in isolation for as long as we have been. So practice, patience,
and all those things that no kid has because they haven't been on earth long enough, right? So, and then because you feel different, because you actually are different, and all of those things come to play. Validating their feelings is really important as you share that life does move forward, but validating it. It's one of those things you can't necessarily fix, but you can help them through.
Excellent note to end on. Thank you so much. That is actually my chat.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I know exactly what I wrote. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Again, if you are joining us on Zoom, I will be following up with an email that will have a link to this video, as well as the material we supplied in person. So you'll be getting that link. And anybody who is on Facebook, please feel free to reach out to Amber McLaren at the Institute for Educational Advancement. I'd be happy to share any of that material as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you in November when we have 2 gifted support groups. Please check online for those and what those offerings are. One will be a hybrid like today's, and another one will be exclusively online. We look forward to seeing you in November. Have a good evening.